Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story: The Dark Ritual, Summoning Demons in the Dark. It was the kind of place that nobody in the small town of Blackwood remembered fondly. The old mansion at the edge of the forest had long been a source of whispered rumors, forgotten history, and a haunting presence that lingered in the minds of those who dared to venture near. No one had lived there for over 50 years, yet it remained, perched like a decaying sentinel, its windows cracked and covered in grime, its doors creaking like the groan of some ancient creature. The mansion was a place where light never fully reached, a place that had known sorrow and madness. On that Halloween night, the chill of autumn hung heavy in the air. Leaves rustled in the wind, swirling about the cobblestone streets of Blackwood, as a group of 5 friends, Adrian, Kate, Olivia, Sam, and Max, gathered at the edge of the forest. They were curious, fearless, eager for something more than the usual tricks and treats. After all, they were young and invincible, their hearts filled with the thrill of Halloween. It was the perfect night for an adventure. "We should go inside," Max said, glancing at the looming mansion. "No one's been in there in years. Let's see what's left behind." The others nodded in agreement, their excitement palpable. The air crackled with the promise of mischief, the sense that they were about to do something daring, something others had only talked about in hushed tones. They had heard the stories, the whispers of the mansion's sordid past, the rumors of strange happenings, and the chilling accounts of people who had gone inside and never returned quite the same. As the door creaked open under Max's hand, a musty odor filled the air, a mixture of mold and dust. Shadows seemed to stretch across the darkened hallway, the faint light of the moon barely breaking through the grime-covered windows. The floors groaned underfoot, and the smell of age was overwhelming. But despite the eerie atmosphere, there was something thrilling about it all. They moved deeper into the house, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. Adrian, who was always the one to take the lead, approached the staircase, his boots scraping the worn wood. "Let's check out the attic. That's where they say the weirdest things happen." They ascended the stairs slowly, the old wood creaking and groaning with each step. At the top, they found a trap door, nearly hidden beneath layers of dust. With some effort, Sam pushed it open, revealing a room that was dimly lit by the narrow cracks in the ceiling. The air inside was stale, suffocating, as if it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. "I found it." Olivia's voice was hushed, filled with excitement and a tinge of nervousness. She stood in front of an old wooden chest, its edges worn and chipped. She opened it carefully, revealing a large leather-bound book. Its pages were yellowed with age, its cover adorned with strange symbols and a peculiar, almost indecipherable script. "What's this?" Kate asked, leaning over Olivia's shoulder to examine the book. "Some kind of old diary?" Olivia flipped through the pages slowly. No, this looks like some kind of ritual. I've seen something like this before in the library. Max's eyes gleamed with a mischievous light. You mean a real, ancient ritual? Like summoning demons or something? Adrian smirked. I bet it's just a bunch of superstitions, but we could try it for fun. We'll be the first to ever do it in this house. How awesome would that be?
After some hesitant agreement, the group decided to perform the ritual, half in jest, half driven by the desire to test their courage. They moved to the mansion's decaying living room, an area once grand but now reduced to ruins. They cleared a space on the floor, gathering candles from the remnants of old furniture and lighting them around the room. The flickering flames cast long, eerie shadows across the walls, their orange glow amplifying the strange symbols in the book. "All right," Max said, his voice lowered to a whisper, as he began to read aloud from the book. The others joined in, their voices growing in intensity. As they spoke the incantation, the air grew colder, and a weight seemed to press down on the room. The candles flickered violently, casting unsettling shapes across the walls. For a moment, nothing happened. They laughed nervously, exchanging glances, unsure if they should be relieved or disappointed. But then the room grew colder, so cold that their breath turned to mist. The candles wavered, their flames dancing erratically, as though caught in an unseen wind. "I think we should stop," Kate said, her voice shaky. "This is getting freaky." But before anyone could respond, a creaking sound echoed from the hallway, followed by faint footsteps, as if someone was moving through the dark corridor. The room went dead silent, save for the sound of their own breathing. Sam's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" "I heard it," Olivia whispered, her gaze darting around the room. "It's like someone's walking out there." Max stood, his face pale. "It's probably just the house settling. Let's just finish the ritual and get out of here." Reluctantly, the group resumed, but now their voices were unsteady, as if they weren't so sure anymore. They chanted the final words, and the atmosphere grew heavier. A low hum filled the room, vibrating in the walls, beneath their feet, in the very air they breathed. Then, a sudden pressure, almost like fingers brushing their skin, made them flinch. Adrian looked over at Max, his face pale with fear. "Something's wrong," he muttered. Without warning, the room seemed to darken further, the air thick with an oppressive presence. And then they heard it, a whisper, low and raspy, as though it was right behind them. "I know what you fear." The words were not their own. The voice came from nowhere, from everywhere, and yet it seemed to vibrate in their bones. A chill ran down their spines, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. "What the hell was that?" Sam stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. The candles flickered, casting the shadows into strange, twisted shapes. Their minds began to unravel, hallucinations creeping into their vision. Dark figures seemed to move just beyond the edge of their sight. The house seemed to pulse with an ancient hunger. And with one final chilling whisper, the house consumed them.
The Ouija board, a gateway to hell. It began as a dare, something to break the monotony of a summer evening, but it ended up far darker than any of them could have imagined.
The attic in the old, decaying house on the outskirts of town had always been a place of intrigue, a relic from the past that seemed to scream for attention. Dust-covered and filled with relics from bygone eras, it was a place the teens had explored many times before. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with anticipation. Jessica, the ringleader of the group, was the first to spot it. Half hidden beneath old blankets and moth-eaten furniture, there was an old wooden box. She pulled it out eagerly, and a strange feeling gripped her as she lifted the lid. Inside, carefully placed between yellowing papers, was an antique Ouija board. The edges were frayed, and the surface was stained with age, but there was something undeniably compelling about it. "What is it?" Eric asked, looking over her shoulder. His voice was thick with the curiosity that hung in the air. "A Ouija board," Jessica said, wiping away the dust. "This will be fun. We can contact spirits." The others exchanged glances, curiosity mixed with a hint of nervousness. The house itself was unnervingly quiet, the only sound the creaking of old floorboards beneath their feet. But they were teenagers, invincible. Nothing would scare them. They had all heard the ghost stories surrounding the abandoned house, but those were just stories. "No one believes in this stuff anyway," Jessica said, as she set the board down on a creaky old table. "Let's just try it out." The rest of the group hesitated, but soon, one by one, they sat around the table, placing their fingers lightly on the planchette. Jessica took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone here with us?" At first, nothing happened. The planchette sat still, unmoving. A few awkward laughs filled the room. Then, with a faint squeak, the planchette shifted slightly, moving in a slow, deliberate motion. Everyone froze. It slowly moved toward yes. "This is ridiculous," Sarah, the skeptic, scoffed. But there was an unease in her voice. "Let's just ask it something normal." "Okay, fine," Jessica said, her smile growing wider. "Are we alone here?" She watched as the planchette glided once again across the board, stopping at no. A shiver ran down their spines. It was too smooth, too deliberate. "Did someone push it?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. "No," Jessica insisted. "None of us did. It must be a spirit." Sarah laughed nervously. "All right, let's ask it something serious then. What's your name?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the planchette moved again. It stopped at the letter M. "Max?" Sarah asked, but the board didn't respond. Jessica pressed her fingers down harder. "Is that your name, Max?" The planchette moved again, this time faster, spelling out the name Malachi. "Malachi," Eric repeated. "That's weird." A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the room was unnervingly still. The air seemed to grow colder. Sarah stood up, brushing her arms. "This is getting freaky. Maybe we should stop." "No, come on." Jessica pushed, her voice now tainted with something darker. "Let's ask it more questions. I'm getting something. I can feel it."
And so they did. Each question brought a new answer, a new revelation, and with every response, the tension in the room grew. Then the questions began to grow darker. "Are you trapped?" Jessica asked, her voice quivering as she leaned in closer to the board.
The planchette moved quickly, stopping at yes. Why are you here? The answer this time was one word: hungry. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and an odd, unsettling silence filled the space. It wasn't just cold, it was as though something was pressing in on them, smothering them with an unseen weight. "Something's wrong," Sarah whispered, standing up suddenly, her face pale. "I don't think we should keep going." But before anyone could respond, the room grew even colder. A deep groan came from the wooden walls. The floorboards creaked, but not from their movement. The sound seemed to come from beneath the house. The lights flickered once, then twice. The planchette jerked forward with a sudden speed, spelling out, "I'm coming." Eric jumped up, knocking the board onto the floor. "What the hell is going on?" For a brief moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of their ragged breathing. Then, from the darkness outside the attic, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the silence. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to the door, throwing it open, but there was nothing there, only the suffocating silence of the house. The wind howled again, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt wrong. They made their way down the creaky stairs, but when they reached the landing, it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against them, suffocating them. The whispers started then, faint, soft, as if coming from the very walls themselves. "Turn it off," Sarah begged, looking as though she might cry. "We need to stop." But before they could even consider leaving, the lights flickered again. This time, when they came back on, the room was different, darker. Shadows moved where they shouldn't have, and a thick black mist curled at the edges of the room. The planchette was back on the floor, moving slowly by itself. It spelled out 2 words: "Too late." Suddenly the doors slammed shut behind them, locking them inside. A deafening roar echoed from below, shaking the house. Then the voices grew louder, voices from the board, voices of those who had been waiting. "Get out!" Jessica screamed, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The mist thickened, and in that instant they all understood. The board hadn't just opened a door to spirits, it had torn open a portal to something far worse, something hungry, and they had no way of closing it. But then, just as their fear reached its peak, the house fell silent. The air cleared, the lights flickered, and the door creaked open on its own. Terrified, they rushed out into the night, gasping for breath. They didn't look back. Days later, when they returned to the house, they found it abandoned, empty. The Ouija board was gone. The terror didn't end, though. Every night one of them would hear a whisper in the dark, "I'm still here." The truth had been far worse than they ever imagined. The board wasn't just a game, it was a portal to hell, and they had opened it. But the last terrifying revelation came when Jessica found something in her own attic. A new Ouija board, with the same dust, the same eerie feel. This time, it was waiting for her. The title of the story: The Blood Moon Summoning.
Eliza sat at her small, worn desk, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room. Her eyes burned with the strain of years spent poring over dusty books and ancient manuscripts, her fingers stained with ink from countless notes. She had been searching for something, anything, to change her life. Her days were filled with monotony, her dreams buried beneath the weight of responsibilities and disappointments. She wanted power, success, to stop being invisible. That night, as the rare blood moon began to rise over the quiet streets of her sleepy town in northern New York, something shifted in her. The air outside felt electric, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Her heart pounded as she leafed through the yellowed pages of a cursed tome she had found months ago, an old book on forbidden rituals and demonic summoning. It had been a long time since she had believed in the superstitions of the occult, but this felt different. The legends whispered of a demon that appeared only once every few centuries during the blood moon, a demon that could grant any wish, but at a terrible cost. Her pulse quickened. The moment was now. She couldn't wait any longer. Desperate for something to change, she prepared herself for the ritual. Her fingers trembled as she traced the symbols in the book. She drew them on the floor with chalk, the thick smell of the powder mixing with the damp scent of the evening air. Her thoughts raced as she thought about her wish, power, success, recognition. She craved them all. She had worked too hard, and it had all amounted to nothing. Tonight, she would make sure that changed. The wind outside howled, sending the trees swaying violently. The moonlight poured through the cracks in the curtains, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. Eliza hesitated, only for a moment. She had read the warnings in the book. What she was about to do would alter her fate forever. But the idea of control, of finally seizing her destiny, was too intoxicating. She whispered the incantation aloud, feeling the words vibrate in her chest. The air grew thick with anticipation. As she uttered the final syllable, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the flame of the candle flickered violently. The temperature plummeted, and her breath misted in the air. The walls seemed to hum with a low, vibrating sound, and Eliza's heartbeat echoed in her ears. Then, as the candle sputtered out, the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe. A figure materialized before her, a tall, cloaked silhouette with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness. It was neither human nor beast, but something in between, something ancient and powerful. The room seemed to pulse with its presence, and Eliza's throat went dry as the creature slowly stepped forward. "I am here." The demon's voice was a low, guttural rasp, like the sound of 1,000 whispers tangled in one. Eliza, trembling but resolute, swallowed hard. "Grant me what I desire, power, success, to be seen, to be acknowledged." The demon's eyes flickered, its lips curling into a twisted smile. "One wish, mortal. Choose wisely." Eliza's heart raced with excitement. She nodded quickly, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Give me the power to control my life, to shape my future however I want." The demon's smile widened, and with a wave of his hand, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the shadows crept closer, surrounding her like a living thing. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, and the demon's form began to dissipate. "Your wish is granted," it intoned, its voice fading into the night. Before Eliza could say another word, the moon's crimson light flickered and vanished, leaving her standing in the eerie silence. She looked around, her heart still racing with anticipation. At first, nothing seemed to have changed, but as the night wore on, she began to notice subtle shifts.
The next morning, Eliza woke to find that she had received an email, a promotion she had longed for, one that would catapult her career to unimaginable heights. But as she celebrated, the seed of unease began to grow in the back of her mind. Her wish had come true, yet something felt wrong. Days passed, and the oddities began to mount. Her co-workers, who had once ignored her, now treated her like a queen. But their praise felt hollow, forced. The world around her shifted, but it didn't feel like the control she had expected. The more she pushed for her desires, the more she felt her surroundings bending unnaturally to her will. And then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like a soft breeze. She heard them as she walked through the hallways of her office, but no one was around. She thought it was her imagination. But then they grew louder, low, insistent whispers, as if someone was speaking directly into her ear. "Everything comes with a price," they said, their voices overlapping and indistinguishable from one another. Her peaceful home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The creaks of the floorboards at night became unbearable. The doors slammed shut on their own, and every time she tried to open one, it felt as if something or someone was holding it back. Shadows darted across her vision, stretching unnaturally across the walls. The whispers followed her everywhere, growing more distinct with each passing day. She began to lose sleep, consumed by the constant fear that something was watching her. "Stop it," Eliza whispered to the shadows in desperation. But the demon's presence only grew stronger. It taunted her, its voice curling around her thoughts. "You wanted power, now you will have it, and more." She tried to undo the wish. She scoured the ancient texts for a way to reverse the curse, but nothing worked. Every attempt to regain control only deepened her terror. The demon was inside her mind, feeding off her fears, and it was growing stronger with each passing hour. One night, as the shadows grew longer and the whispers louder, Eliza realized the truth. The demon had not come to torment her. It had come to test her. The power she sought wasn't something to be controlled. It was a reflection of her own desires. She had asked for control, but what she truly needed was the ability to let go, to accept her own imperfections, to stop striving for an impossible version of success. And just like that, as the blood moon began to fade into the horizon, the demon's presence evaporated.
The whispers ceased, the shadows retreated, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Eliza was left standing in the silence, trembling. The terror was gone, but so too was the power she had sought. It was then that she realized the horrifying truth. She had never wanted power. She had wanted approval, to be seen for who she really was, not through the lens of someone else's expectations. But in her pursuit of external validation, she had lost herself. As dawn broke and the first light of the day spilled into her room, Eliza stood alone. The demon was gone, but it had left her with a terrifying revelation. The power to control her life had always been hers, but she had to learn to wield it with wisdom, not desperation. And the price for that lesson had nearly cost her everything. In the quiet aftermath of the blood moon, Eliza knew she would never be the same.
The title of the story: The Devil's Mirror, a Reflection of Evil. Luca had always been curious about the occult. As a child, he would sneak into his grandmother's attic, where she kept boxes of old books and mysterious artifacts that piqued his interest. Over the years, his fascination grew into a near obsession with the supernatural. He'd read everything he could find about summoning spirits, ancient rites, and dark rituals. But something about the idea of mirrors, ancient, cracked mirrors, fascinated him the most. There was something inherently terrifying about them, a reflection that wasn't quite you, something lurking beneath the surface. One cold afternoon, in the heart of a forgotten town, Luca wandered into a small thrift store tucked between two crumbling buildings. The air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew, and the low hum of the store's single light bulb barely illuminated the clutter. Shelves were filled with worn furniture, strange trinkets, and old portraits, all bathed in an unsettling silence. But in the back, behind a row of faded curtains, Luca found it. A large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with symbols he couldn't recognize, and its surface cracked like a spider's web. He felt an inexplicable pull to it. As his fingers traced the cracked glass, a chill ran down his spine. The mirror seemed alive, its surface undulating slightly, as though breathing. The shopkeeper, an old man with a wrinkled face and piercing eyes, noticed Luca's gaze and spoke in a raspy voice. "That one, it's not meant for the curious. It's dangerous," the man warned, his eyes lingering on the mirror with an unsettling unease. But Luca, driven by a mix of excitement and disbelief, ignored the warning. He bargained for the mirror and took it home that very day. As soon as the mirror was set up in his small apartment, Luca felt a strange tension in the air. It was as if the mirror had begun to change the very atmosphere of the room. The once sterile, quiet space now hummed with a subtle, disquieting energy.
For days he couldn't keep his eyes off it. He would stand before it for minutes at a time, just watching, almost hypnotized by its cracked surface and the dim reflections it cast. One night, when the apartment was quiet and the wind howled outside, Luca decided to conduct a ritual. He had read about the ancient art of summoning in an old book, a collection of rituals passed down from cultures that revered mirrors as gateways. The book warned of great danger, of entities that existed in reflections, waiting to be summoned. But Luca was confident. He had practiced before. He lit candles in a circle around the mirror and whispered the words from the book. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost tangible presence. And then the reflection moved. At first Luca thought it was a trick of the light, but when he looked closer, he saw it. His own face, twisted, pale, with eyes that gleamed with malevolent intent. His reflection grinned at him, a grin that didn't belong to him. It was him, but it wasn't. The room went cold. The air felt suffocating. Luca's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to step away, but his feet felt glued to the floor, his eyes unwilling to leave the mirror. The reflection inched closer, its grin widening impossibly, until it spoke in a voice that was both his own and something far darker. You summoned me, Luca, and now I will take what's mine. The reflection began to move independently of him, its hands clawing at the surface of the glass. Luca stumbled back in horror. He tried to break the mirror, but every attempt seemed futile. The more he struck it, the stronger the reflection grew. It was no longer just a reflection. It was alive, and it was coming for him. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. His reflection in the mirror didn't just move when he did. It did things he didn't. It made faces at him, stuck out his tongue, and sometimes even watched him while he slept. Whispers filled the air at night, voices that sounded like his own, but wrong, distorted, guttural, dripping with malice. Each time Luca tried to shatter the mirror, it seemed to grow stronger, more unrelenting. He couldn't escape its presence. The reflection began to invade his mind, filling him with twisted thoughts and dark impulses. He began to wonder if he had truly summoned something from the depths of hell, or if the mirror had merely awakened something inside him, an evil he never knew existed. Days turned into weeks, and Luca's sanity began to fray. He couldn't tell where his own thoughts ended and the reflections began. The whispers at night grew louder, urging him to act. His reflection started to speak to him more directly, coaxing him to do things he would never have dreamed of before. Harm people, destroy things, give in to the darkness within. Luca grew desperate. He couldn't live like this anymore. He needed to destroy the mirror once and for all. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a hammer and swung it at the glass. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the room filling with a deafening crash. But when the shards of glass settled, Luca saw something that made his blood run cold. His reflection was still there, not in the glass, but in the shards themselves. It wasn't gone. It was everywhere. And then he understood. The mirror wasn't just a portal. It was a vessel containing something far darker than just the reflection of his own face. It had taken hold of him, body and soul. The demon had become him, and he had become it. It wasn't a matter of breaking the mirror anymore. The mirror was already inside him. The mirror's reflection grinned from every shard, whispering his name. And in that moment, he realized that the true horror wasn't the mirror. It was himself.
The title of the story:
The Pentagram in the Forest. The cold air gripped their skin as they made their way through the dense forest, the pale moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. The trees, twisted and gnarled, seemed to have a life of their own, reaching down with their skeletal limbs as if trying to pull them into the shadows. Kyle, the unofficial leader of the group, grinned as he trudged ahead, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. "We're almost there," he said, glancing over his shoulder. The others followed, their faces lit with excitement and the thrill of the unknown. They were a group of seasoned adventurers, always seeking the next challenge, the next mystery to unravel. This one, however, was different. They had all heard the stories of the pentagram in the forest, a place where people had vanished without a trace, where strange occurrences had been reported for centuries. But they weren't afraid. At least, that's what they kept telling each other. Samantha, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "It's just a myth. There's no such thing as demons. This is just a place where people got lost in the woods and made up stories to cover it up." Mark, the quiet one of the group, shivered despite his bravado. "Yeah, but it's still creepy. The air feels off." "Stop being such a baby," Kyle teased, though his own voice carried a note of unease. "It's just a bunch of trees and dirt." They reached the clearing just as the last of the daylight disappeared behind the horizon, plunging the forest into near darkness. In the center of the clearing was a rough, jagged outline of a pentagram, carved into the earth, worn smooth with time, its edges still faintly glowing in the dim light. The group set down their backpacks and gathered around the symbol. Samantha rolled her eyes again, but pulled out a piece of paper with the ritual printed on it, an ancient incantation in Latin. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice a little shakier than she wanted to admit. Kyle nodded, pulling out a knife and cutting his palm. Blood dripped onto the ground, pooling around the edge of the pentagram. "What's the worst that could happen? We're just having some fun." They each followed suit, making small cuts in their palms, adding their own blood to the ritual. Their hearts raced, and their breaths came quicker, but none of them could admit it was because they were scared. No, they were just excited. Samantha cleared her throat. "All right, here goes," she said, her voice trembling just slightly as she began to chant the Latin words.
The others joined in, their voices growing louder with each word. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves in a way that felt unnatural. It wasn't a breeze, it was something more, something deliberate. At first, nothing happened. Then, as they reached the final verse of the incantation, the ground beneath them trembled. The wind turned cold, biting into their skin. The trees creaked, and the shadows around them deepened, pressing in as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A deafening silence followed. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. And then the whispers began. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from. The voices were soft at first, faint murmurs that could have been the wind or the rustling of branches, but as they grew louder, they began to form words, screeching, distorted words that seemed to crawl into their minds like worms burrowing through flesh. Get out! The ground beneath them shifted again, this time violently, as if something beneath the earth was waking up. Kyle stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear. What the hell is happening? Suddenly, a figure appeared in the trees. It was tall, too tall, and its body seemed to flicker like a shadow being cast by a flickering light. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque mask of contorted features, its eyes glowing red, fixed on them with an unnatural intensity. Samantha screamed, but the sound was cut off abruptly, as though the air itself had turned to stone. Mark's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, his face pale, eyes wide in terror. We've done something," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The ground began to crack open, and dark tendrils of shadow stretched upward, snaking around them like serpents, pulling them closer to the glowing pentagram. The whispers grew louder, now all around them, suffocating them with their vile presence. "We have to close it!" Kyle shouted, his voice rising in panic. They turned toward the pentagram, scrambling to erase it, to break its hold. But the more they tried, the more the symbol seemed to sink deeper into the earth, glowing brighter, pulsating with an eerie rhythm. The air became thick, suffocating. One by one, the group members began to fall, dragged into the abyss by unseen forces. And then, just as Kyle was about to fall himself, the ground suddenly stopped trembling. The whispers faded. Everything went silent. It was over. They were free. But as Kyle stumbled to his feet, gasping for breath, he looked around. His friends were gone. There was no sign of them, no marks on the ground, no signs of struggle. Only the dim, faint glow of the pentagram remained, now darkened and faded. And as Kyle turned to leave, he heard the whisper one last time. "Welcome to your new home." And with that, the forest fell silent once more. The title of the story: The Candle of Souls, a Demon's Pact. The rain hammered relentlessly against the windows of Elias's apartment, a constant barrage of cold, rhythmic drumming. The storm outside mirrored the storm brewing inside his mind. For years he had toiled away at his thankless job, struggling to make ends meet. There was no glamour, no thrill in his life. He was merely a cog in a wheel spinning without purpose. He had grown tired of it all, the suffocating monotony of his existence. But on that night, alone and consumed by his yearning for something greater, he stumbled upon a relic that would change everything. The tattered book was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the dusty second-hand bookstore that barely survived in the decaying district of the city. The shop was filled with the musty smell of paper and mildew, its floorboards creaking with every hesitant step Elias took. He had entered simply to escape the storm, but the faded pages of a strange occult ritual book caught his eye. He knew nothing of the esoteric symbols or the foreign language scrawled across the pages, but one sentence stood out, a promise too enticing to ignore. A single candle, lit on a stormy night, can summon the demon who grants any wish, but at the cost of a soul. Skeptical, yet intrigued, he bought the book. His disbelief told him it was just a superstition, a concoction of medieval fantasy. But in his desperation, the possibility that it could be real seemed to offer the only escape from his mundane life. That night, when the thunder rumbled and the wind howled outside, he found himself lighting the candle described in the book, his fingers trembling with both excitement and fear. The flame flickered with an unnatural intensity, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. He muttered the incantation, his voice trembling, not fully convinced, but not fully dismissive either. At first, nothing happened. The candle flickered, the room remained dark and silent, and Elias laughed at himself. But just as he was about to snuff the candle out, something changed. The air grew thick, heavy with an electric charge. The temperature in the room dropped, and Elias's breath clouded in the sudden chill. A whisper, faint and hollow, echoed in the corners of the room. He turned, eyes wide, but saw nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared, tall and cloaked in shadows, its form twisting like smoke. The creature's presence suffocated him, its very existence causing his heart to race. A voice low and guttural reached his ears. "What is it you seek, mortal?" Elias couldn't speak. Fear had locked his throat. But then the thought of his empty, mundane life surged to the forefront of his mind. He spoke quickly before he could lose the nerve. "I want wealth, power, influence, everything I've never had. Give me a life worth living." His voice trembled with desperation. The figure before him studied him with unseen eyes. "Your wish is granted. But remember, nothing comes without a price." Before Elias could respond, the figure vanished as quickly as it had come. The candle's flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Elias sat there, stunned. He felt the weight of the silence pressing against his chest, a lingering dread creeping into his bones. And yet a strange anticipation filled him. Could it be true? The next morning, he awoke to an entirely new reality. His dingy apartment had transformed.
The furniture was replaced by sleek, expensive pieces, and the walls were adorned with artwork worth more than he had ever seen in his life. His bank account had swelled beyond imagination, and he found himself surrounded by luxuries he had never dared to dream of. The world suddenly seemed to bend to his will. He had everything he had ever wanted.
But as days passed, the unease grew. Strange things began to happen. At night, Elias would hear faint whispers in the air, whispers that seemed to call his name. He would turn, expecting to see someone behind him, but the rooms were always empty. The shadows in his apartment no longer obeyed the light. They shifted, twitching as if alive, curling around the corners of his vision, always just out of reach. One evening, as he wandered through his new mansion, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, yet eerily out of place. He froze. The footsteps echoed from the hallway, each step slow and unnervingly close. But when he rushed out to confront whoever had entered, the hallway was empty. Only the silence answered him. The days grew darker. Every time Elias looked in a mirror, his reflection seemed different, hollowed, as though the life had drained from his eyes. He became plagued by disturbing visions, faces contorted in agony, souls screaming silently, their features twisted beyond recognition. He realized, too late, that every wish he had made had come at the cost of someone else's soul. His mother, once kind and full of life, now appeared in his dreams, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken, a ghostly whisper of the woman she had been. She was calling to him, but the words were incomprehensible. A figure in the corner of his mind, a twisted thing, seemed to claim her, to steal her essence, as if she had never existed in the first place. As Elias grew more desperate to rid himself of the curse he had brought upon himself, the demon's presence grew more tangible. He could no longer ignore it, no longer pretend it was just his imagination. The very walls of his mansion seemed to groan and creak with its presence. The demon was watching, waiting. In a moment of panic, Elias retrieved the book from the depths of his closet. He thumbed through the pages, searching for a way out, a way to break the pact. His eyes landed on a single cryptic line. Destroy the candle, break the bond, but beware, the demon knows your every move. With trembling hands, he searched the mansion, looking for any sign of the cursed candle, but it was nowhere to be found. He had been careless. He had dismissed it in his greed. The demon had already taken it, already bound him completely. There was no escape. In a frantic bid to end it all, Elias set fire to the book, watching it burn as the flames leapt higher. But even as the book smoldered, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The shadows closed in. The last of the candle's wax was gone. And then the voice returned, closer than ever. You have tried to escape, but you cannot. You were never in control, Elias. Elias spun around, his heart pounding, but the demon was nowhere to be seen. In that instant, he understood the truth. The demon had never needed to claim his soul. His freedom, his very will, had been the true price all along. In his final moments, the realization crushed him. The deal had never been for wealth or power. It had always been for his soul, his autonomy, his very essence. The demon had never been interested in his riches. It had already won the moment he lit the candle. Elias's vision blurred as he collapsed to the ground. The shadows around him were no longer just dark shapes. They were alive, swirling, reaching for him, consuming him from the inside out. But there was no escape. The candle had burned long ago, and Elias was left with nothing but the silence of the void. And in the end, the demon never even had to ask for the soul. It had taken it all without ever having to say a word.